Well, today we come to the second part of our new series, a series that we are calling Work in Progress. And if you had to miss week one, or if you don't remember from last week kind of what is at the center of things, here's what's at the very center of this series. Our character, or I would even say our personal character. Now, as we kicked things off last week, we did acknowledge this, that in our world today, when it comes to what most shapes us, what most shapes our character, there certainly is a lot of debate when it comes to what is kind of most important or most significant. For example, some would say, gosh, it's just genetics, right? That's what shapes us most, helps us become who we are today. Others would say, no, it's more so the environment we grow up in. We think about the parenting we've experienced, the family we grew up in, where we are maybe even in the birth order, right? Still others would say, no, it's really neither of those things. It comes back to life experiences. That's what most shapes us, especially who we marry and the children we have and the experiences we have, like even the work that we get involved in. Now, we ended up last week in the same place that we should always end up when it comes to this debate. It clearly is all of these things, right, that shape us and form us. But here's the really good news in all of that, because some of these things have shaped us in negative ways, right? So here's the really good news that we embraced last week, but that we also want to embrace today. No matter how these things have shaped us in the past, starting today, we now get to choose what will most shape our character in the days and in the years ahead. That is good news indeed. And so with that in mind, here's what we're looking at in this series. What God most wants to shape our character each day so that our character might end up looking like the character of Jesus. In this series, we want to look at what God most wants to influence us and shape us so that we might grab on to those same things as well. While we dealt with the virtue of honesty last week, and if you had to miss last week, I encourage you to go online and watch what we dealt with last week. While we dealt with the virtue of honesty last week, today we turn our attention to this, the virtue of compassion. And as we do that, I want us to first look at our definition today of compassion. Here's what I'm thinking in terms of how we define this. Compassion is a deep awareness of the suffering of another, accompanied by the wish to relieve it. Again, a deep awareness of the suffering of another, accompanied by the wish to relieve it. Guys, with that definition in hand today, here's what we want to do. We want to take a close look specifically today at how Jesus himself lived that out. Because when we do that, we find three things that true compassion requires of us. Here's the first. First and foremost, true compassion always involves a level of awareness, a level of, or a measure of awareness. And we certainly see that very early on in Jesus' ministry. In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 and 36, we find these words. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Guys, here we find toward the beginning of Jesus' ministry, not just a glimpse of this virtue of compassion. Instead, what we find here initially really is a first key element of this compassion. That first key element being this willingness to be in the presence of others enough so that their needs might be brought to light. Because if we can't see the needs, we can't possibly begin to meet them, can we? In other words, think of it this way. In other words, initially, awareness is everything when it comes to compassion. Say that with me. Awareness is everything when it comes to compassion. Had a long phone conversation, not this past week, but the week prior. And what this person was saying to me, in essence, was this. Knowing that we live in one of the poorest counties in the state of Florida, some of you may not know that, but that is, in fact, a fact. He was saying to me, knowing that we live in one of the poorest counties in the state of Florida, do we really know the needs of those around us? Or to use our word today, he was asking, are we aware of the needs that exist in Polk County? And of course, the point he was making was simply this. If we don't, then it's going to be hard for us to be the church that God would have us be. Again, while awareness might seem like a pretty obvious place to begin when it comes to compassion, so many people and churches skip this step simply because they're not willing to really invest themselves in people's lives. And so first we ask this today, are we, as a church, but also as individual Christians, this applies to all of us individually as well today, are we in our community, in the lives of people around us enough in order to be aware of their needs? And if not, then how can we change that? And let me just say with this first thought, if you are incredibly passionate about this, I think all of us would say, hey, this is important, got it. But if you're incredibly passionate about this, helping us mine for the needs around us, then let me know that so I can connect you to a key place to serve here at Beamer. Now, while it's important for us as followers of Jesus to first off embrace awareness as part of our pursuit of compassion, if you will, here's what we then must do next. We got to take action. And here's what can best fuel that action, how compassionate God has been with us. It's one thing to think, oh gosh, I see some needs around me. I want to express compassion there. It's another thing to be all in when it comes to trying to meet those needs, because we realize how compassionately God meets our every need. Make sense? In 2 Corinthians 1, verses 3 and 4, Paul writes this, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ," hear this, "the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that," always key words in a passage, "so that we can now comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God." Now, first off, I want you to notice what it doesn't say here. And maybe it's harder to do this when you're studying Scripture on your own, but it's helpful at times to just ask that question. Okay, what doesn't it say here? So we don't make an assumption as to what we're reading. First off, here's what we don't find here. It doesn't say here that God really feels for us, so we should feel for others. Nor does it say here that God really sympathizes with us in the midst of our pain and struggle, so we too should sympathize with others. Instead, here's what it says so clearly. Don't miss this. It says God takes action by comforting us in the midst of our pain and suffering, so that we might now take action by comforting those around us in some very concrete ways. And it's critical for us to see that here for this reason, because compassion is not just a feeling. Instead, it's a virtue, right? A virtue that is part awareness yet, but it's also part action. Which means this: it's only when we attempt to begin to meet a need, only then do we truly begin to live out not just any compassion, but the compassion of Christ. And so ask yourself, secondly, today, are you consistently adding action to awareness? The more aware you become of where compassion is needed in our world, are you consistently bringing action to partner with that? And then here's a final thing that true compassion involves or points us to: alignment. Hear that. Alignment. And let me say more about that. Guys, if we truly want to be compassionate people, then when a situation calls for that, here's what we've got to ask ourselves over and over and over again. How can I align my heart with the heart of Christ in this given situation? And here's why that's such a key question. Because if it's God's compassion that motivates us, think of that. If it's God's compassion that motivates us to be compassionate, then it truly is the heart of Christ that now guides the actions we take, or that now guides the work that we embrace. Jesus speaks to that very thing with these words in John chapter 14, verse 12. Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do what? Will do the works that I have been doing. Guys, most weeks as I end a service, I say something like this as my closing words: God, help us this week as we strive to be the presence of Christ in the presence of others, as we strive to be the presence of Christ in the presence of others. And that's really, in large measure, what we're talking about here. How whenever we come alongside those who are hurting, whenever we come alongside those who need a measure of compassion, we've got to keep asking ourselves over and over in those situations, okay, how can I align who Jesus would be in that moment with who I am truly striving to be? Alignment, so critical here. Now let me just say this as we wind things down today. To reflect on this virtue, the virtue of compassion, to reflect on this is great, and I love doing this kind of thing with you each week. But this will mean very little for us if we're not now willing to do this in a few moments when we leave this worship experience. Now we've got to do this. We've got to ask ourselves, okay, what can help me now to grow in this virtue? What can help me to become more compassionate day after day and year after year? And so as we close with that in mind, consider some things that really can help us. For example, one of the things that can help us to be more compassionate is to simply pay better attention to the people around us. I'm talking close family members and friends, strangers we encounter, and everywhere in between. One of the things that can help us to be more compassionate is to simply pay better attention to the people around us. And sometimes that involves just the simplest of things. Like when we ask someone in passing, "How are you doing today?" What a gift we can give them if we're willing to really zero in on not just their words, but also their demeanor, also what we see in their eyes in that moment. Or another thing that can help us to grow in this virtue is this: when we sense someone is in pain and in need of compassion, we need to simply do something in that moment, however small it might seem. And here's why that's important. Because often the needs that we do see around us, sometimes just in one individual's life, but often when it comes to all of the needs we see around us, often when it comes to those needs, they can overwhelm us to such a degree where we end up feeling like we can do nothing. Again, that's why another way we can grow in compassion is to take action immediately, however small it seems, in that moment. The American painter John Sargent, really the leading portrait painter of his generation, once painted a panel of roses that was highly praised by critics. It was a small picture, but it approached perfection. Although offered a high price for it on many occasions, he always refused to sell it. He considered it his best work and was very proud of it. Whenever he was deeply discouraged, think of this, whenever he was deeply doubtful of his abilities as an artist, he would look at it and remind himself, I painted that. Then his confidence and his ability would come back to him. Again, when we at least do something, however small it seems, in the face of pain and hurt, when it comes to our attention, then that gives us something to look back on as well. That sense of, I did that with God's help, even though I was overwhelmed in that moment. So of course, today and in the future, with God's help, I can do those kinds of things as well. And then lastly, this can also help us as we strive to grow in compassion, allowing for interruptions. Allowing for interruptions. You know who was the very best at this? Jesus himself. He was the king of allowing for interruptions. As just two examples, and there are too many to list in the Gospels in Jesus' life, but as just two examples of him setting this example for us. Remember him interrupting his teaching tour at one point in order to have dinner with, in order for him to offer compassion to this hated tax collector of all people, right? Zacchaeus. That wasn't on his calendar, and yet in the midst of allowing for that interruption, the good he was able to do in that life. Or remember him interrupting his travel plans at one point in order to bring healing to, in order to bring compassion to a woman who had reached out to him in a crowd just to touch his robe. That interruption meant everything to her, and Jesus knew he had to be open to it, that he might do what God was calling him to do. You know, I've found in my own life, and I bet some of you have found this as well, I've found that some of the best examples of God working through me, some of the best examples of that have come disguised as what? They've come disguised as interruptions. Guys, how easy it would have been for me to miss those compassion moments had I not been open to that interruption. And thus the question is, so how can we more and more make that just a natural part of our walk with Christ? Guys, as we journey into another week, here's what I encourage you to think about. One, of these three things that true compassion requires of us, where are you the strongest, and perhaps where are you the weakest? Where are you strong and you can build on that? Where are you weak and you need to address that? Awareness, action, alignment. Some of you would say, gosh, I think I'm weak with taking action. I know the needs that are around me. I'm not stepping forth. Then knowing that you're strong with awareness, fix the weakness. Others of you would say, gosh, I pray and pray and pray that I might align my heart with that of Christ. I'm not now allowing that alignment to impact awareness and action. Then work on that. So first off, consider that. But then two, think about this as well, of these three things that can help us to become more compassionate. Pay attention, do something, allow for interruptions. Of those three things, what are you willing to really grab onto today and say, I know this will make me stronger when it comes to the virtue of compassion. So today and in the weeks ahead, I'm going to really start working on this. Of those three, what are you willing to commit to today to start working on? What a gift it is always to be with you in this way. I thank God for you, and I pray that, having been together in this way, you and I might begin to live more and more compassionate lives.